I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. If you were to list off a handful of jobs that have stood the test of time in terms of meaningfulness, popularity, and all-around importance, I bet you'd be hard-pressed to come up with a set of ideas which does not include nursing. Now I dare you, check that, double dare you, even triple dare you to go and ask a class full of kids what they want to be when they grow up. Guaranteed, you're going to have a few nurse answers in there. What explains this? Well, for one, probably has something to do with this whole nature of the work being special. The preservation of life and sometimes literal saving of it tends to resonate with people. Now, of course, this profession has undergone massive changes since Florence Nightingale devoted her life to the work in shaping a modern nursing over 200 years ago. Just take the very types of nursing designations and specializations there are, ranging from RNs or registered nurses to NPs or nurse practitioners to critical care nurses to several other types. Last I checked, there's well over 30 different nursing specializations. And this point is but one topic of discussion on the program today. I've got a leading nurse practitioner waiting in the wings who has worked in multiple countries and with all ages of patients. And she's here to break down her work and profession from all angles so as to allow you to decide whether this line of work could be for you. So first up, let me fill you in a little bit more on our guest today, and then we can slide into this exploration of the field of nursing. Lauren Scott is a primary care nurse practitioner at Women's College Hospital, and she's a passionate women's health advocate. Now, before becoming a nurse practitioner, Lauren had an exciting career as a registered nurse working in neurotrauma at Canada's largest paediatric hospital and travel nursing in Australia. Lauren graduated from the prestigious Global Health Nurse Practitioner program at the University of Toronto. And she has an extensive teaching background, working as an interprofessional education specialist at the Sick Kids Center for Global Child Health, working primarily on a Caribbean initiative training registered nurses in Trinidad. And she's also worked as a clinical instructor and preceptor for RPN, RN, and NP and medical students, as well as family medicine residents. And for the past 8 years, she's been working in primary care at Women's College Hospital. Her clinical practice focuses on women's health and procedures, and her research interests are in pain management for ambulatory procedures and contraception. Lauren is also a national speaker and trainer on contraception, and she's an adjunct lecturer at the University of Toronto Schools of Nursing and Department of Family and Community Medicine. And finally, she's also a member of Ontario's Emergency Medical Assistance Team, or EMAT, and has been deployed in situations of medical emergencies in northern communities and in COVID response efforts. So with all of this noted, I'd love to welcome you to my conversation with Lauren Scott. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Lauren?
I'm doing great. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Very good. Looking forward to this conversation. We were just chatting a little bit, before getting this recording going about, mutual connection we have and a past guest of this program, John Atkinson. And really excited for this conversation with you. I think your background kind of speaks for itself and eager to share all about it with listeners. So with all of this in mind, I do have the first segment lined up. It's something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just read off a definition of something related to what the guest is all about. Now, surprise, surprise, I have you down here for nurse practitioner. So let me just read this off, and then after you comment. Does it sound okay?
Sounds great.
All right, so here we go. Nurse practitioner. A nurse practitioner, or NP, is an advanced practice registered nurse and a type of mid-level practitioner. NPs are trained to assess patient needs, order and interpret diagnostic and laboratory tests, diagnose disease, prescribe medications, and formulate treatment plans. NP training covers basic disease prevention, coordination of care, and health promotion. There we go. First take. What do you think of that?
That's a really great overview. The one thing I'll say is some people have a little bit of conflict with the term mid-level provider. So how I like to describe it is it's kind of a maximum nurse as opposed to in between a nurse and a doctor. That can be a little confusing, especially for the general public. So it has the largest scope of practice for any of the varying levels of nursing. But we study from the nursing body of knowledge and have that experience as nurses before doing advanced practice. So we don't go to medical school. We're not physicians, although a lot of the day-to-day can look very similar. But if you think of all the great things about nursing with that advanced scope of practice, you have a nurse practitioner.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I think that simplifies it because for an outsider, even for somebody like myself as well, I'm kind of thrown by that and I've always been thrown by that. And even looking at the definition of it, it still didn't really clarify things until you just sort of like put it out there. So I appreciate that right at the gate here. Is there anything else that you'd like to emphasize or even maybe de-emphasize from that definition?
I know there's so much, political turmoil, especially on what nurses can do in scope of practice and kind of this turf war sometimes. But I think, anyone who's been in the healthcare system, particularly the Canadian healthcare system, there's more than enough work to go around. And when we allow all clinicians, whether it's a physiotherapist, a practical nurse, a nurse practitioner, physicians, to work to their top of the scope, patients and the general public benefit, right? So there's really, we want this to happen. We want to include nurse practitioners. I'm so biased to work in more settings. So I would say they're the max nurse and not a mini doctor.
All right. All right. Again, I like this. I just think it's clarifying a lot of things for people, especially for young people that are trying to like make sense of the field that you're within. I mean, there's so many different specialties for one, but then also these different designations as well that can be a little bit confusing when you're just sort of like looking at it for the very first time. So yeah, it does help, I think, in that sense.
For sure. I think even nursing is a little bit confusing because I can proudly say I'm a nurse and there's practical nurses who study from a 2-year college program, a registered nurse who typically does the 4-year baccalaureate, and then a nurse practitioner who is an RN and then does graduate degree. There's also doctorate prepared nurses who have PhDs and doctorates, right? So, but we're all nurses. So there is, of course, confusion just within that realm.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was one aspect that I had to sort of like clarify for myself, at least initially, in like going about this episode. And I've had another nurse on this program as well. Same thing that I really had to like, update myself just because, it gets your head spinning a little bit, I guess is what I'm trying to drive at here. Now, I did mention off the top to listeners, a little bit about your background, but this might be an opportune time to hear a little bit more about, the work that you're involved in.
For sure. I mean, I think nursing is such an incredible and diverse and dynamic career. And I've been really fortunate to do a lot of things in my 16 years as a nurse. So I went into nursing right out of high school, really not knowing what a nurse was, but that it seemed like a good program, getting a Bachelor of Science degree. And then I did, my first job was in acute care pediatrics. So I actually worked on the neurotrauma at sick kids. And I did that for about 4 years, and that was quite intense. And now in retrospect, I realize that intensity probably led me to do some travel nursing just as a break. So I did some travel nursing in Australia, but I ended up at the Children's Hospital there. So doing very similar work. And then I got into the NP program, did my graduate studies. And then for the past 8 years, I've been doing comprehensive family medicine, which has evolved with a specialization in women's health and procedures. But I've been fortunate, I worked on a mobile health bus for homeless youth. I've done a lot of teaching with several universities, and I'm still a member of the emergency medical assistance team. So we're deployed when areas are just beyond what their capacity is. So we've been deployed to Indigenous reservations and, whenever there's a need for assistance. So when the Afghani refugees were repatriated, we were literally at the airport providing care. We were at the Air Force when Canadians were coming back from Wuhan at the beginning of COVID. So fortunately, it's a very infrequent job, but it's an amazing organization to be a part of. So even, within my career, I've done so many different things and worn so many different hats. So there's certainly never a dull day.
Absolutely. That was one of the things that struck me when I was diving into the research of this conversation is just the amount of varied experiences that you have. And I know we're going to get into this a little, later on in terms of some of the international experiences and what you're deriving from all of that. But just, just nationally speaking within Canada as well, like a lot of what you were just explaining there's a lot. There's been a lot that you've covered in your career. So yeah, I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about that soon. But before we do that, maybe we could step into yet another segment here, a day in the life, to add even more clarity to the work that you're presently doing right now. I don't know if it's going to be impossible for you to describe a day, maybe a week is a little bit better, but however you want to go about this, I'd love to hear a little bit more.
For sure. So currently I work in family medicine or primary care, and it is truly across the lifespan. So I'm a generalist, which means, jack of all trades, master of none. There are certainly people that specialize and have a passion for one thing. But in my day to day, I might start my day with a 3-day-old baby coming in for their first check of life. And then I might see a senior for chronic disease management, and then switch to an adolescent for contraception, then switch to an acute care presentation, a strep throat and ear infection, and then pop and see a pregnant woman for her maternity care. I've done, home visits and end of life care and really anything you can think in between, but that you're presenting in an ambulatory setting. So you're walking in and able to, book an appointment and do those types of things. But it's a little bit of everything. And there's definitely, I'm always put on my toes. And I had a really wonderful mentor, nurse practitioner, when I first started my career. And I remember him saying, at least once a year, I save a life. And I think of that too, where there's something that you catch, that really odd case or something where you're like, wow, I really did great work today, in addition to all of the regular care you get to provide. And the great thing about family medicine and primary care is people are generally well. You get to see the happy visits, the well children, in addition to some of the acute care, but we're not seeing, crazy traumas or those devastating things that the acute care hospitals would see.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that level of variety must be helpful as well. Like you said, the words that you use, it keeps you on your toes, and that must be a big part of the fulfillment that you're deriving, which you're sort of just describing as well there.
For sure. It can definitely be overwhelming when you're starting because you can feel like you're just getting a grasp of something, and then a weird rash and a traveler comes in, or, you see something you haven't seen before, but there's always some challenge. So if you like being challenged, it's, you're never complacent in primary care.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Again, just envisioning like all these different types of patients, my own experiences, like any, human being going into these offices and receiving care is, you're right. I mean, these people like professionals like yourself are, meeting all types of people, all ages, constantly. And because of that, yeah, I would imagine that like the learning curve would be a little bit steep, at least initially, because you're kind of building a base of knowledge with all these different sort of like groups within the segmentation of the population, basically, right? Yeah, that would take some time.
It does. And that's why a team approach, I think, is so central, right? I don't consider myself like a solo practitioner. I'm so fortunate to work with an incredible team who, of course, mentored me when I was a learner. And now I'm able to provide that mentorship, but also colleagues that we consult each other formally and informally within the practice. And then our interprofessional team members. So when there's, complex medications, I have a pharmacist that I chat with. When there's a baby who's struggling to gain weight, we have a registered dietitian, right? Like it really is a team approach to all healthcare.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's something that could be intimidating, without that insight or that reminder there is like, oh, going at this, I'm going to be responsible for this, this, and this. Well, yes and no. I mean, like you just said, you're going to have a team of professionals behind you, people that you can lean on. Yeah, derive some benefit from all the years of experience that they've put in as well. So yeah, okay. Well, maybe we could hop around yet again to another segment of Pathways One. Here we're going to rewind a bit here. And I'd love to know what initially hooked you into the field of nursing. It's always fascinating to hear from guests, like what brought them into their particular line of work. And yeah, I'd love to hear it from you, Laura.
That's a great question that I reflected on. And I think, I was fortunate not to have super close interactions with the healthcare system when I was young. So again, like I mentioned, I wasn't like, of course I knew what a nurse was, but I didn't understand the depth and the scope of nursing. It was really, I hate to say this, probably based on the university. So McMaster was far enough. I mean, we're both from Niagara. It was far enough that I could be away from home, but not so far that I couldn't come back if I needed anything. It was a great school. Again, I still had a Bachelor of Science, but fortunately, with a career path at the end. So when I was finishing high school, the job market wasn't that robust. So being able to be employed right after university was such an appeal, but then still having the flexibility of a Bachelor of Science. And then when I got into nursing and really had my eyes open, I found it fascinating and really fulfilling. So, of course, I think that anyone who goes into a health profession has that motivation of wanting to care for people, wanting to help people. But you also have to have a high level of intelligence and motivation, right, to complete these comprehensive studies. So I think it's really that blend of a challenging and very rewarding profession.
Okay. The word that you used there was you found it fascinating, I guess, from the outside looking in. And yeah, I'd just like to return to that point really quickly. Do you recall like what elements were really kind of hooking you in at that point?
I think when there's such a privilege of caring for individuals in the worst times of their life, and that's typically acute care hospitals, right? So when you are critically ill, when you are at the end of life, and you are the person that's caring for them, and I don't mean that as like holding their hand at their bedside, but who's assessing them, helping assist with their care plan, doing, very intense dressings, medication titrations, all of those things. I mean, I don't think I really realized like, wow, that's what nurses are doing. And that's a really, really remarkable job that I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I mean that's probably one of the defining elements of it. Like I guess when you consider what a nurse is, like just in the truest sense, it would be something what you just explained there. And that's a unique sort of role that an individual can play within society. Obviously, that's very, atypical, I suppose, of, as compared to a lot of other professions. Like you are really truly making a difference in someone's life and preserving that life, at times, or it can be, interpreted in that sense. So yeah, I can see that. As far as how you began to narrow down your specialities, because you again mentioning this off the top, you have narrowed it down and you've been working within certain sectors within nursing. Maybe you could speak to that point as well.
For sure. So I knew through my undergraduate placements that I wanted to work in pediatrics. So that was, just from my clinical experience, that was a population that I wanted to work with. And so when I applied to Sick Kids, it was the neurotrauma floor that was hiring, in September of 2008. So that was my entry point. And then it was an incredibly challenging job in terms of a long mentorship where literally we were reading journal articles and reviewing them with our preceptor. Like they set a quite a high bar, and I really thrived in that environment. And then you were taking care of like acutely ill children. So again, very challenging, but very rewarding. And then there was a level of burnout after working in acute care peds. There's a funny story, I can tell it later, but really I applied to the NP program because I have a very dear colleague who's probably the smartest nurse that I know, and she's actually completing her doctorate. She applied for her NP and was waitlisted and was given some feedback on how to strengthen her application. So she had gone through this process. So when I was in Australia, I was like, oh man, I need that list. I need to know how to strengthen my application. So I'm going to throw one application into the hardest school to get into. And then I was accepted beyond so that was a big surprise. And then I called them and I said, can I defer? I'm having a great time in Australia. And they're like, nope, it's now or never. So that's what prompted me to move home and complete my NP. So that's kind of a weird tangent. And then primary care, I was like, oh, this is my home. I like a little bit of everything. I still get the peds, but these are generally well children. And then it really, over the past few years, I focused in women's health and procedural care because any woman who has had an IUD or a pap smear, they know that these are quite uncomfortable. So myself and my colleague, this is the hill we're going to die on. We are going to make this the best experience that we possibly can. And that's where, we've done some speaking and additional training, especially with medical learners. And then seeing that feedback of a medical student or a resident who's completed a procedure and the patient saying, that was the first time this didn't hurt, or, oh my goodness, you're done. And then that kind of feedback that we get all the time is so rewarding.
Yeah.
So I hope I answered your question. We went on a little bit of a journey there.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Because what I liked about that in particular is like, it shows kind of like this refinement of an individual, like discovering what they want to do within their careers. I think the perception, at least again, from young people's perspective, is like, oftentimes people walk into careers and they have this big vision and they just beeline to where they end up, and like, that's the perspective, I think. But like, that rarely happens, at least on this program. So you can well over 100, guests here. And it's so rare where that happens. What's more realistic here is what you just described. I think there's a certain degree of refinement over the course of, sinking yourself into the career that you realize, okay, well, this area here, yes, I have an interest, but maybe I'm not going to go so deep into this now. I'm going to go off to the left here, go off to the right a little bit and dive into this area. This is a little bit better suited to who I am or what I would like to do or how I'd like to contribute. And I think your points illustrated that. Like, you just sort of eventually realized some things weren't going to be for you, but these other areas here, held your interest in a different manner, and you could see how you could contribute in a different way. So yeah, I really like that answer.
I think some people don't realize how vast opportunities are, especially within nursing. So, I've been fortunate enough to do some clinical instructing for college and university level. And you can be a full-time teacher as a nurse. You can be in policy development. You can be completely in research, or you can be, in the trauma bay, bedside, or you can switch. You can do the bedside for a little bit and then do a little bit of teaching or a little bit of private practice. So it's not like you're stuck in one pathway. And if you get, lifestyle, now I have kids. So, working 12-hour night shifts and holidays would not be as, I didn't have the flexibility that I did in my early 20s. So it evolves over time and you can change even as a nurse. We wear so many different hats. So that's one thing that is really dynamic about this profession.
Yeah, I love that insight there. We can step into another segment here, Q&A Discovery, and continue this back and forth. And I have this other question in terms of, again, this outsider's perspective on the work. And one of the things that kind of strikes me is like some of the challenges associated with it, and obviously some of the rewards too. I mean, one of the ways, though, getting back to the challenges is like this constant evolution of the field that you're within. I'm thinking medical knowledge, procedures, techniques, constantly, updating themselves. And this constant churn of all of this taking place must be challenging for professionals like yourself, especially as an NP. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you grapple with some of those challenges in particular.
That's a great question. And what's so interesting is when I started as a nurse practitioner, our scope was limited so much more than where it is now. So we were not able to prescribe controlled substances like narcotics. We weren't able to order things like CTs and MRI scans. So it was very limiting when you were working. And then, if that was the appropriate trajectory for your patient and you weren't able to do it, you'd have to, find a physician colleague and have your piece of paper and say, please sign this. And even when I started nursing, we were paper charting, right? Like the big files, writing out a super long thing. So even in my career, we've gone to computers and online charting, electronic medical records. And I think some of it can be overwhelming, or there's a bit of a fear of change, but it ultimately, once you get past that hurdle, will make your life easier. And I'm really excited now because we have things like AI scribe. So you're not spending, half of our interaction is me going to be here, half listening, but really I have to chart and then do the consult note. So I think, as things in technology are evolving and scope is evolving, of course, there's an appropriate respect for this additional, especially with the scope of practice that's coming down, but it's all for the benefit and it's going to make your patients' lives better and your life easier. So it's a win-win. But you got to roll with it, roll and evolve with the times.
Yeah, I'm sure. And part of that probably is institutionalized, where like wherever you're working, they're introducing this technology, and it's kind of like, well, you have to, like, there's really no choice. But for other things, I would imagine as well, it probably lies in the hands of somebody like yourself. Like, how much do you want to dig into, say, industry news, or I don't know, are you reading up? I'm sure you are. You're reading up on the latest information, facts, figures relating to X, Y, Z. Like, to what degree is that part of your work?
It depends where you're employed, because ultimately, if you're especially a hospital employee, like you are bound by their policies and procedures. So it's good, especially at the level that I'm at now. We're part of the nursing leadership team, and we have the hospital admins, the VPs, the CEOs, like we have access to them in meetings. So when there is something that you're passionate about in terms of policy change, you can actually influence that change. And really, having, I think, patients at the table is really important. So trying to cultivate all of that inclusion. But really, so I'm doing some research now in terms of pain management with gynecological procedures and trying to, advocate for that. So you have to stay on top of the political landscape, and, you kind of have to dance the administrative line if you want to influence that type of change, which is not everyone's skill set, right? Like a good clinician does not make a good politician necessarily.
Yeah. But that's a great hidden insight there, though, in terms of doing that job well and reaching levels of success, much like yourself, and what you've been able to accomplish in your career. Refining some of those skills becomes a bit of a critical need, I would guess, I would think, at least the way you just sort of explained it there. So yeah, I think that's a great
For sure.
insight. This other question here, that's certainly a challenge we were just speaking of. As far as some of the rewards, you've lightly spoken about them already. I mean, just the interactions with patients and, ultimately being able to help with their care. Is there anything else that stands out to you in terms of that, the rewarding aspect of the work?
I think what's so interesting is I'm very proud to call myself a nurse. And, when you tell someone that you're a nurse, there's almost like this instant trust, right? That you are a seemingly good person who's trustworthy, who's doing good in the world. And so to, go through my adult life with just that immediate kind of buy-in is a really interesting perspective. I think obviously in the acute care settings, the rewards are so much greater, but also, the trauma and the downsides are so much greater. So that's a challenging balance. But I mean, especially taking care of acute children, like there's nothing more rewarding. So, you don't mind the long hours or the crying and the beeping and all of those things, because you literally have the most precious lives in your hands. So that's amazing. And now I get to do, similar work, get to see, brand new babies and tired moms and support them with their journey. So I don't know a lot of jobs that I had either before healthcare that had that kind of continuous reward and fulfillment in it. Challenging, yes, but the rewards far outweigh that because you're getting them almost daily.
Yeah, there's a certain degree of intimacy in the work itself. We're really getting to know some of these patients and some of the struggles perhaps that they're going through, or as you mentioned, maybe the adults themselves, whether it's or the kids. You're getting to know these people is, I guess, what I'm trying to get at here, and I think that's special. I mean, like not all jobs offer that, certainly not, but yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, certainly within nursing, that's a big element, and with that comes a certain degree of stress and pressure, but also great degree of reward. Yeah, I get that.
Absolutely. You're a caretaker of these incredible moments in their life of birth and death and illness and change and all of that. And you get to witness that alongside them, right? So it's very interesting. And some funny and embarrassing moments, right? Or awkward encounters along the way, for sure.
I'm sure. Some of the unexpected surprises. Yeah, most definitely. Okay. This other question just popped in my head as well. Like, I would imagine that this experience could be very different, like working in a small community versus certainly in a big metropolis.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you're probably going to run into your patients at the grocery store and in the street, or your kids are on the same soccer team or what have you. So again, it's that level of kind of confidentiality and accountability of all of that insight and information that you have, and that, you're seen as a certain member in the community, that you have to hold yourself to, a high standard. I would say, especially, I can consider that coming from quite a small town compared to, there's a little bit more anonymity in Toronto. And I think maybe now we also accept our healthcare providers to have other interests. They can be artists and musicians and and that doesn't take away from their medical knowledge. So hopefully there's more kind of openness to that now.
Returning to this point that you brought up at least once already, I think, and off the top, I did mention this. Some of your international experiences within the profession, Australia. I also understand you were in Trinidad. Maybe you could speak to that as far as like what that was, all about, and then secondly, like what were you deriving from those experiences?
For sure. So Australia, again, now reflecting, was definitely me running away from burnout and just needing a change of pace after that acute care nursing, but then ending up in acute care nursing, but having, the best experience. So, being in Australia, I was there in 2012 and 2013 and traveling all over. So wonderful, wonderful experience. What I did in Trinidad was a bit of a different project. So I went back to sick kids right after I finished my NP. I did a parental leave job. And then when that ended, I went back to sick kids as an educator. But my job was actually teaching nurses in 6 different Caribbean countries, but we were based in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies. So physically located there, teaching pediatric hematology and oncology. So again, that was like this really interesting of my advanced practice nursing degree, which I had as a nurse practitioner, and as my experience as a teacher, that allowed me to go international. But still, I was still employed by a Canadian organization with all of those kind of protections and benefits, but able to work there I was there for about 9 months on and off. Incredibly rewarding, just working with lower and middle income countries to like elevate their acute pediatric knowledge. Again, not sustainable when you have a family and other responsibilities, but it's just interesting how these things kind of piece together at the right time in my life. So very different international experiences, but doing that as a Canadian nurse was really fun.
Yeah, I bet personally and professionally, I could see, the benefits of doing it and having those things kind of come your way. Is that something that you would recommend to somebody who's in the profession, who's, pending their life stage and whatnot? If they're able to do that, would you recommend it?
And there are, shorter experiences that you can do, especially with different Canadian organizations that are more of a capacity building. So we even have that now, especially through U of T and through Sick Kids. They still have those programs ongoing. So if that's a passion in terms of capacity building and supporting low and middle income countries, that's a very noble path to take. The travel nursing is fun and a different experience. And kind of, if you're someone who's passionate about travel, then it's a very affordable way to do that when you're just also working as you go, but both were great experiences.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, this program itself being, global in nature, and myself being here based within Japan, that aspect to me is always fascinating, and having the opportunities to go abroad or to, be exposed to different cultures and different ways of thought. I don't think it's ever a bad thing for an individual, but certainly it depends on the person and whether or not they're drawn to that type of adventure. I mean, that's kind of the right word, at least how I look at it. But
Oh yeah, and to see a different healthcare system, right? So especially if you travel nursing and you're used to the very Canadian way of doing things. So again, it was 12 years ago that I was in Australia, but at that time, so I don't know if it's changed now, only doctors did blood punctures, like inserted IVs and did blood. And it was a little bit more, nurses were kind of task focused, where nursing in Canada was very much like, critical thinking, part of the team. So I remember working in the emergency department, and one of the doctors was like, "You're Canadian?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Can you do IVs?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then he just handed me a cart and a list and was like, "Do all my work. Like, just go to each of these kids, put in their lines, draw their labs," because they're like, "Finally a Canadian." And it was such a valued skill. It's so interesting to reflect on. Don't get that much credit these days, but that was super fun. Like, "Oh, the Canadian, you can go do this."
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah, there must be tons of those little moments that you're picking up, and you're able, again, that word that you use there is like reflecting on it later on. You're learning so much, whether you're like conscious of it in the moment or it comes years later. I think there's a lot of benefit to that. So yeah. Okay, that's one more question in this segment here. I mean, broadly speaking, your professional experiences, initiatives, and ambitions kind of speak for themselves, in terms of what you've accomplished thus far. And I'd love to know, what has been the driver of all of this activity? I would, at least on paper here and in this conversation, a bit of a high-end achiever, I would say, within your field. Now, what is the driver of all of this? What would you say it is?
That's a great question. I grew up raised by an amazing single mom who was just an incredible hard worker. So that was always role modeled for me that, nothing is just handed to you, that you have to work and work hard. I'm also a twin. So I've been in competition, not that it's a competition, but, growing up. So I've always had kind of a hunger to excel. And I'm always interested by different things. So, I always say yes when an opportunity presents itself. Some people are knee jerk no, I'm a knee jerk yes. And then we'll kind of deal with the dust afterwards. If it's a terrible idea, I can always get out. But I typically, say yes and see what happens from there. And so far, it's been pretty good. So here we are. So I would say, yeah, just say yes.
Yeah, there we go. I love that. I love that insight there. Okay, well, we're heading into this middle segment, a water cooler story segment. And this is just a part where I invite, guests to indulge listeners with a story related to their work. And I'm quite keen to hear what you have for us today, Lauren.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you a personal story, if that's okay, like my experience on the other side of the gurney, as they say in white coat, black art. So, we're all patients as well, right? Even if you're totally healthy, we interact with the healthcare system at different times. I have 2 children, so I've gone through lots of touch points in terms of my maternity care and birth and my small children. So my second son was born by C-section, and he had a little bit of breathing support right after he was born. So he was assessed by respiratory therapists, by the doctor who delivered him. He was assessed by a bunch of people, and we were sent to the postpartum floor to recover. And then I remember they said, oh, this is mom's second baby. She's an NP. We're going to let you guys go home, right? Like, you're fine. You don't need to be here. To the point where my husband had gone to get the car because we're in Toronto. We weren't parking downtown Toronto. So he went to get the car. And my nurse on the floor, her name is Michelle, and I will never forget her because she's one of those veteran nurses, has probably been a nurse for 25, 30 years. And when we talk about retaining talent and nursing, this is the example. So she looked at my son and was so calm and so direct. But she said, okay, mom, I'm just going to take your baby. We're going to do a little check, like just cool as a cucumber. And then she took him, and I'm like, haven't slept in 36 hours, just had surgery. Like, I wasn't super thinking clearly. And then she came back and she said, okay, you're going to see lots of people around your baby. You're going to see this. And I remember like having a moment where I'm walking into a code and just this like complete kind of out of body experience. And they were resuscitating my son because what we then found out was that he was born with a very large lung tumor that was about the size of a baseball as a 7-pound baby. And what you might not know is with pediatrics, typically respiratory depression leads to cardiac arrest. That's the progression. So he was fine. He was taken to the neonatal intensive care unit. We saw all of these doctors, and he's fine now. He's 2.5 and driving me crazy. But this nurse, Michelle, literally saved his life. The RN, who had lots of experience, and just how she managed everything was incredible. So I'll never forget her. I've emailed her since because you can find people internally in the hospital system. It wasn't my hospital, but I remember sending her a photo on his first birthday and just saying, like, we'll never forget you. So that's my water cooler story.
That's quite the story, I must say. And like, there's so many different directions to go with this. But yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that hits me, and would hit anyone, I'm sure, is just like, one, like the profession itself, and engaging with professionals such as this, Michelle, that you just described. That type of experience obviously would stay with anyone. But you having intimate knowledge of the system and how it could go, maybe in the not the best way, I suppose, right? Or the best interaction that could have been handled much, much differently. But, the point that you raised of this individual having certainly a lot of experience in handling it, quite coolly and professionally, and, keeping a new mom, as calm as possible and in such a trying situation as that, I think speaks to the point of the degree of refinement that a person can go through within their career.
And that clinical gestalt, right? Because my son had been checked out, stethoscope on him by like I have nothing but respect for physicians, work closely with them, adore them. But like he had been checked by multiple physicians and respiratory therapists, given the clean go ahead. And she just looked at him and she knew. And she saved his life.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? Right. Again, I just return to this point of the profession and like the impact, obviously, that an individual can have on another person's life, or,
For
a
sure.
family's life, in this sense here.
And I'm sure like I've been on the other end, hopefully. Like I can recall stories where I had a patient come in to see me. He had seen multiple providers, was diagnosed with a leg infection and kind of sent on his way. And again, something I was like, maybe it was my inexperience at the time. I was like, something's not right. You've come in already, measured his calves. There was a difference in the calf size, which is a red flag for any healthcare providers who are listening. Sent him for an ultrasound and actually found that he had a deep vein thrombosis, so a blood clot in his leg. And those can travel to your lungs and cause a pulmonary embolism, which is often fatal, or a stroke, like catastrophic side effects. So, and I can remember, times at Sick Kids where I've literally held a child as they've passed. So it's a journey for sure throughout healthcare. And then there's of course funny moments when things get stuck in orifices and you have to come in and pull them out. Like that happens far more than anyone cares to admit. So yeah, it's definitely the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you just throw those those added sort of like insights at the end there, because you're right. I mean, like that is healthcare, isn't it? Like that's I think even from an outsider's perspective, you have to be prepared for just about everything and anything that's going to come your way. So
Yeah.
it kind of like it takes a certain type of individual, I think, to be able to thrive perhaps in that environment. Maybe not like right out of the gate, but like you have to have this sort of willingness to be able to go with the flow, and that's an interesting point to consider as well when you're looking at, careers, obviously.
Sure. And I think, there's always those kind of stereotypes, like emergent nurses are all sarcastic with like a dark sense of humor, and ICU nurses are very like type A and organized and, leaders. Anyway, it's just funny when you kind of see those tropes in real life. But there are certain personalities I would say that are probably appeal to different specialties and then generalists.
There you go. There you go. We are rounding the bend in this last segment, a crystal ball segment. And here, as the name implies, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And we've spoken already lightly about this topic of technology as far as its, impact on the profession and whatnot. I'd love to hear a little bit more about this in ways that you're finding the work is changing. Again, you've mentioned this, going from paper to digital and everything else in between there. But, AI being the big one, it's shifting things around a lot, several different industries. But maybe you could bring listeners up to speed on what you're seeing right now and maybe even, what we could be seeing in another 5-10 years.
I think we have to be very cautious with technology, but how it's being, played out, especially AI in healthcare, is really interesting because there's always feedback that you don't have enough time with your clinician, right? That they weren't necessarily as personal. And really, we're all humans. Despite the years and decades of training, we're still humans and we make errors. So in terms of documentation, I think it's great that you and I can have a conversation and AI can just transcribe a note that's then in your chart and not biased on my opinion of what's happening, but just the actual facts of what happened in that transaction. And I think there, in terms of clinical algorithms, in terms of imaging and AI being able to detect things that the human eye cannot, is a really interesting and helpful frontier. Where I'm like wondering if there's going to be some conflict is if AI and the specialist disagree on what the finding is and how that will play out clinically. But also, we spend so much time memorizing clinical practice guidelines and the latest literature, and it's really hard to keep up versus if you're able to kind of, not to say that you want to like you're Googling, pop someone's symptoms into an algorithm, but have that support of the, world of knowledge to help you diagnose and the best treatment plan, I think is all really positive. So hopefully it makes, again, patients safer and the lives of clinicians easier is my hope of where that direction is headed.
Yeah. This is a point that comes up, time and time again with a lot of professionals across so many different industries. It's like this defining the way it's going to be used and how we're going to use it as a tool. To what degree are we going to give this amount of, power to it? where are we going to dial it back and say, well, okay, you're not going to touch this in particular. I'll let you support me in my efforts when I'm doing this particular activity, but you're not going to do it all, And I think it's still kind of like early days, obviously. A lot of industries and a lot of professionals are trying to figure out, policymakers, of course, too, to what degree are we going to allow this technology to, infiltrate workflows and whatnot. So yeah, that's an interesting one. And I'm sure that presents a lot of interesting challenges and questions, particularly within your field right now.
For sure. So to be determined on that one. We'll see.
Yeah. But you can see the benefits, and it's coming, and you can see how it's going to help, at least in some of the more mundane tasks, and maybe free you up to be able to like have more clarity to sink yourself into like really analyzing a patient's care or needs. Well, I've got to say, we've absolutely blown through this conversation here, Lauren. I've enjoyed it from start to finish. But I think what you did provide here is just the perfect amount, a great base to really like get to know the work that you're involved in, and find out whether or not it could be for them. So thank you for joining the program today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I would definitely say, if you're considering being a nurse practitioner, it's an excellent career path.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Lauren and her work, you can do so via LinkedIn as well as Instagram. And for reference, all this information, including these links to these platforms, will be in the show notes. And hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share. To show further support, you can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And as I mentioned off the top, head on over to YouTube. I do have a channel over there which hosts highlights from these audio recordings. And I would absolutely love a like or subscribe. Really trying to grow that channel as best I can, and your support would be greatly appreciated. Now, finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.